whatever happened to the WAGs? For a good few years, they were some of the most adored women in the country, the wives and girlfriends of England's footballers, on the front of every magazine, all over the back pages, sometimes the front pages as well. And yes, they got a lot of stick for the shopping, the champagne, and the eye-watering price tags. And yes, there was a chunk of people writing them off as gold digging, all tan, no substance. But honestly, if you look at how much attention and influence they had, you could argue that they were the closest thing that this country ever had to homegrown royalty. And then the whole thing just sort of ended. WAG went from a word that sold magazines to a word the women themselves now find insulting and want nothing to do with. I don't think WAG completely disappeared. I just think, I don't know, it evolved into something far less impressive. What really happened is much more interesting, and weirdly, it's relevant to anyone trying to build any kind of name for themselves, whether or not you're dating a footballer. So today we're going to talk about everything: where the WAG came from, the fashion, the sexism, why she quote quote died. But I'm also trying to answer two questions. First, why did a couple of these women turn a tabloid punchline into a genuine business empire, while others who started in almost exactly the same position just vanished? The next question is, where did the WAG actually go? So let's focus on where the WAG brand came from. Footballers' wives being tabloid figures isn't exactly new. Back in the 60s and 70s, Bobby Moore and his wife Tina were basically the glamorous golden couple of their day. The Posh and Becks before Posh and Becks existed. But the WAG as this huge cultural thing really kicked off in one specific place, in one summer in Germany during the 2006 World Cup. England set up their training base near a quiet little spa town called Baden-Baden, and the FA let the players' wives and girlfriends stay down in the town, free to pretty much do anything that they wanted. So that's exactly what they did, and the press pretty much followed them everywhere. This was the British tabloids at their absolute height of their power, and they completely lost their minds over these women. Victoria Beckham was at the top of the pecking order. She was already a Spice Girl and married to the captain, so she was the most famous person there by a mile. The town actually put her name up in lights when she arrived. And then you had Cheryl, who was in Girls Aloud at the time and dating Ashley Cole, and then you had Coleen, who was Wayne Rooney's girlfriend. The stories were honestly relentless. 56 grand spent in an hour of shopping, champagne being drunk through straws, 60 pairs of sunglasses. And honestly, the thing is, some of these headlines and stories were just exaggerated or completely false. And that basically sums up how the media viewed the WAGs. They weren't really news, they were entertainment. A character the papers were building day by day because she sold more copies than almost anything else they had. And I genuinely feel like for the press, it was easier to come up with these lies and exaggerations for women than men because, let's be honest, the press did not respect women at all. They were even called hooligans with credit cards, and a Spanish paper did its own version and called them hooligans with visas. So the question becomes, why couldn't we look away? Why did all of this work so well? Why couldn't the country look away? I think there were two things going on at once, pulling in from very opposite directions. The first one is aspiration. The WAG was the perfect fantasy because she felt close enough to touch. She wasn't some untouchable Hollywood star living behind a gate in LA. Some of these women were basically people you grew up with, women that you went to school with that were now living this life. She was a normal, often working class girl from somewhere like Newcastle who you might actually see getting her tan done at the same salon you went to. So she was relatable and aspirational at the same time, close enough that you could imagine being her, glossy enough that you really wanted to. That combination is incredibly powerful, and brands chase it constantly. The second thing is a bit darker, and it's resentment, because the same newspapers selling you the fairy tale were, in the same breath, punishing these women for living it. And underneath that was a very old British thing about class. a discomfort with women, especially working class women, having money they supposedly hadn't earned the right way. There's even a phrase for that instinct called tall poppy syndrome, where people build someone up and then can't wait to cut them down for getting above themselves. The WAGs are part of that same moment as Katie Price, working class women who got rich and famous on their own terms and then got mocked relentlessly as thick or vulgar for it. Point of view, this made the WAG an incredibly valuable product because the public loved her and resented her in equal measure. The love sells the fairy tale on the way up, and the resentment sells the takedown on the way down. You basically get to sell the woman twice, and that's exactly why the press could never leave her alone. And as we'll see, the pattern never really went away, it just moved countries. Swiftly moving on to the fashion. Probably know the style even if you don't think you do. The deep fake tan, the caramel highlights, Cheryl's new boy cap, a bodycon dress for the evening. If you were one of the Liverpool girls, a dress from a boutique called Cricket is what you would wear. Loads and loads and loads of layered jewelry. And then the two things that finished off almost every single look: massive sunglasses and a designer handbag, ideally a Birkin that's held on your arm like a trophy. Now, you have to bear in mind that the handbag, it was never really about how it looked, right? It was about everyone being able to see that you could afford the bag. There's actually a term for this in branding called Veblen good, which just means a product whose whole point is that it's expensive and obvious about it. That's exactly what the bag is supposed to be doing, to show how expensive it actually is. These women didn't just wear expensive things. Why they became so popular is that they sold an affordable version of the look back to everyone else that was watching. That's why the high street deals were such a big deal. Coleen fronting George at Asda, for example. So this WAG was collaborating with Asda, not Gucci, not Chanel, but Asda. You couldn't afford Victoria's Birkin, but you could buy the dress that Coleen was modeling at Asda for a normal price and feel like you had a little piece of that world. So the WAG basically became the bridge between a Premier League millionaire's wardrobe and the average woman's high street. That's a proper working business, and most people didn't clock it as one because they were too busy mocking the fake tan. They were able to basically create this parasocial relationship with fans by saying, hey, I have a slice of this world, but you can look like me, you can be part of this tribe, and here's the affordable version. The fashion world absolutely mocked them. For years, WAG style was the go-to insult for tacking new money, trying too hard. There was this classism about it. The same magazines that would later put these exact women on their covers spent the 2000s using them as a joke. Which is a lesson in itself, by the way. Sometimes people will laugh at you or mock you before you blow up. Keep going, keep being consistent. Keep doing your thing, because sometimes people just don't see the vision. But look at fashion now in 2026. You've got low-rise jeans, the tracksuits, the mob wife thing, everyone obsessed with Birkins again, full-on WAG core all over TikTok. It's all coming back. And there's actually a reason this stuff returns when the economy is kind of rough. It's sometimes called the lipstick effect. The idea that when money's tight, people still treat themselves to small, fun, shiny things. And there's the whole thing of nostalgia, right? People are returning to what made them feel good. People are returning to a time that was fun. People want to be involved in the things that make them feel young again. So I do believe that we're seeing aspects of WAG culture creep back up in certain ways. And that is because people are just longing for what was. And then of course there's the fact that Gen Z is now discovering some of the OGs of the WAG culture. And you've got the current England partners. I don't think they have the height of fame that the Victoria Beckhams and the Clooney's had. But what they are doing is changing one really important thing. The 2006 version of being a WAG was all about being recognizable. The bigger the logo, the more obvious the designer, the better. The 2026 version is almost the opposite. Now it's all about originality, custom pieces, one-off upcycled stuff. You see it on a few of the current partners. But I guess the But I guess the clearest example is Tolami Benson, who's engaged to Bukayo Saka. She calls her style sport chic. She wore custom denim shorts with the number 87 on them, which was Saka's first squad number at Arsenal. So that's the real shift we're noticing when it comes to WAG culture. The flex used to be, look how much this cost. Now it's, you can't buy this, it's one of a kind, and it actually means something. Marketeers have basically been saying for a long time that we were moving from signaling status to signaling authenticity. And as we know, anyone that works in media, authenticity was the major buzzword for last year and the year before. The only problem is now you have people performing authenticity, pretending that things mean something to them, pretending that they care about politics, care about social issues. So now the new word seems to be taste. Okay, authenticity, well, you were performing it and copying other people. Now we want to see if you actually have taste. Where did this idea come from? Is it your own idea? I want to take a step back, right, and talk about why fashion specifically is such a powerful branding tool. Let's start with the most basic factual reason. Fashion is the fastest form of communication there is. Before you say a single word, what you're wearing has already told everyone something about who you are, what you can afford, what group you belong to, and what you value. It's a language that people read automatically on sight. So as a branding tool, it's just incredibly efficient. It's unfortunate at the same time because, there are studies out there that prove that how good looking you are, not just in terms of your face or your body, but even what you're wearing can impact whether you get the job, whether you get the partner, and how people in society treat you. The second reason is that clothing is repeatable, and repetition is how brands actually get built. A signature look basically becomes a logo. Think about how Victoria Beckham's enormous sunglasses basically became a statement, or Cheryl's newsboy cap became instantly recognizable shorthand for everyone. When you wear the same recognizable thing again and again, people start to clock you on sight, and that recognition is one of the most valuable things any brand can have. The WAGs understood this without anyone teaching it to them. They had a uniform, and the uniform is really just a logo that you can wear. For most of history, women were judged on their appearance, whether they wanted to be or not. Fashion was also one of the very few areas where women's taste was actually taken seriously, even celebrated, and where there was genuine money and genuine authority on offer. So the next part, I really want to talk about two individual brands. I want to compare these two women because they started in almost identical positions, but ended up in completely different positions as well. Coleen Rooney and Alix Earle. Look at how similar they were. Both from Merseyside, both working class. Alix was a nail technician before all of this. Both met their footballers young, before any of the money, when nobody knew these lads would become two of the best midfielders England produced. Both got swept into the 2006 circus. Coleen launched a perfume, Alix launched a perfume, and then she called it Alix, and it was one of the best-selling celebrity fragrances of 2007. Coleen wrote a magazine column, so did Alix. Coleen did fashion ranges, Alix did a fashion range too. Now look at where they are today. Coleen Rooney is essentially her own media company. Alix lives a quiet, private, by all accounts, very happy life, and her brand more or less stopped growing around maybe 2011 or 12. Same starting point, completely different finish line. And when that happens, it's usually not luck, it's down to a few choices. Now, obviously, bear in mind, a lot of this could have been intentional on Alix's part, and then there's the personal life stuff. What we're going to focus on is solely the branding side. The first one is owning things versus renting your name out. If you look closely at what Alix actually did, her perfume was a deal with OK magazine, and her fashion line was a collaboration with an existing brand. Those are licensing deals. You lend your name, you take a fee, but somebody else owns the actual business. It's definitely good money. I mean, no one's complaining, but you don't end up owning anything. Coleen over time kept steering her ventures towards things she actually owned for herself. So one of them was renting her fame out, and the other was using it to buy assets. Coleen kept changing what she was. First the relatable mum, then weirdly a detective, then a businesswoman, then a wellness brand. In marketing, you'd call that a brand extension, taking a name people already trust and stretching it into different arenas so you're never relying on the one thing that made you famous in the first place. She treated her fame like something you keep building on, not a single thing that you do once. I have to be very fair here because this is a story about brands, not about who's a better person. Alix seems genuinely happy. She's been with Stephen for nearly 2 decades. They've got 4 kids, and she chose a bit more of a quieter life, and that is perfectly fine. right? That is perfectly fine. That's a completely valid choice, arguably a healthier one. But as a branding case study, there's only one line that sums up the whole thing. The singer Jamelia took a dig at Alex and said, God forbid if Alex Curran split up with Steve Gerrard, who would she be then? It was meant as an insult, but it's actually the single most important question in building a brand. If the thing that made you famous disappeared tomorrow, would there still be a you left over? Coleen spent 20 years quietly making sure the answer was yes. And the two women right at the top of the WAG world understood this from the start. Cheryl said it out loud back in 2006. She got annoyed at being called a footballer's wife and said footballers' wives have no careers and live off their husband's money. And Victoria, years later in her Netflix documentary, was completely honest about it. She said being a WAG was partly attention seeking and that it was how I stayed in the conversation. She knew exactly what she was doing the whole time and she used it to build a real fashion label. We have to ask ourselves who was allowed to be the fairytale? Who was actually allowed to be a WAG? Because if you look at the famous list of names, the queens, the sweethearts, they were almost always white. And that's worth sitting with because English football is not a white sport, mind you. There are a lot of black players. Black players are under 5% of the UK population. Black players are under 5% of the UK population, but by recent counts, they're around 40% and rising to half of the top flight talent. And yet, if you look at the WAG list the papers rolled out every tournament, you'd struggle to find a black woman on them. Now, there's a whole conversation in regards to black men and whether or not they date black women. And when players did date black women, you could see how the coverage and the press talked about them. Now let's talk about something very important. When England got knocked out in 2006, the press blamed the WAGs. Of course they did. The circus, the distraction of all of it. They said, oh, it's the WAGs' fault, it's the girlfriends. And by the way, you see that same narrative now. Oh, Jordan Woods was at the game, so she's the one that made them win. Oh, Jordan Woods brought her bag or didn't bring her bag. That's why they lost. Never mind that Wayne Rooney himself got himself sent off and England played most of the game with 10 men. The women weren't even on the pitch, but they made a much better story than the team did. And the scrutiny on them was set up so they could never win. If they partied, they were vulgar hooligans. If they stayed quiet and well behaved, they were boring or stuck up. The judgment was never really about how they behaved. It was the fact that they existed. Visible, wealthy, working class women having a good time. So when people point at Coleen, Cheryl, Victoria as proof the WAGs all did brilliantly, just remember those three were the exceptions, not the rule. The machine, aka the press, the institutions, used most of these women for a season or two and then dropped them. The route from WAG to mogul was real, but it was also very rare, and a lot of the cozy where are they now pieces quietly skipped this part over. Now let's get to the question, who killed the WAG and what actually replaced her? So let's really think about it. What actually killed it? A few things. There was the ban. The New England manager Fabio reportedly called the whole thing a virus and basically locked the partners out of the 2010 World Cup. There was the 2008 financial crash, which made all of that conspicuous 57 grand an hour spending feel obscene almost overnight. And there was the players themselves changing. The Gareth Southgate era of England was deliberately disciplined and media trained and one could argue a bit boring. And on top of that, the footballers became their own influences. So the wife was no longer the only person in the house worth putting in the papers. Because of the rise of social media, everyone now was kind of influencing. But the biggest reason, the most structural one, was the death of the middleman. Through the 2010s, the celebrity magazines that ran on WAGs collapsed as everyone moved online. And the thing that replaced them, social media, handed these women something they'd never had before, a direct line to the public. So suddenly a footballer's partner could post her own photo, write her own caption, sell her own product. There used to be a handful of professionals watching on a deadline. Then they'd go home, relax, sleep. Now it's millions of people watching all the time, with no deadline, no off switch, which has led to some people wanting a private life. I would argue the biggest difference of the WAG now is that she's already famous. Before, you could become a WAG. You could be looking so good in your corner shop and a guy could spot you out. And so these women aren't borrowing fame from sports anymore. They're bringing their own audience to sport, two brands boosting each other. And I generally do wonder whether or not there are manufactured relationships as well. And then there's the fact that they're no longer relatable. The whole idea didn't disappear, it just went global. And the clearest place to watch that happen is Formula One. So the WAG didn't die per se, it just evolved. 10 years ago, women were about 8% of F1's audience. Today, it's around 42%. It roughly quadrupled, and 3 out of the 4 of the sport's new fans are women.